My name is Daniel Richardson, and I'm 78 years old. For most of my adult life, I've been a military tactician and historian, studying the great battles of World War II, analyzing strategies, teaching at the Army War College, writing papers on desert warfare. I thought I understood the North African campaign better than almost anyone alive. Then, 6 months ago, I discovered that one of the most brilliant tactical operations of the entire war had been systematically erased from the historical record, and the story of what really happened at Mechili in April 1941 would fundamentally change how we understand desert warfare, tactical deception, and the early years of the war in North Africa. It started with a routine assignment. The War College asked me to review some newly declassified British military documents for potential inclusion in our curriculum. Most of it was standard material, operational reports, and after-action summaries we'd seen versions of before. But buried in a box of papers from the Western Desert Force, I found something that made my heart race. A complete operational plan for an ambush at Mechili that bore no resemblance to the battle I'd been teaching about for 40 years. According to every history book, every published account, every official record I'd ever seen, the Battle of Mechili in April 1941 was a disaster for British forces. Rommel's Africa Corps had surrounded the garrison, and after a brief siege, the British surrendered. 2,000 men captured, significant equipment lost, a humiliating defeat that exemplified the early German dominance in North Africa. It was taught as an example of what happens when forces are caught out of position by a more mobile enemy, but these documents told a completely different story. They described a deliberate trap, a carefully planned ambush that used the garrison at Mechili as bait to lure German forces into a killing zone where British armor and artillery would destroy them. The plan was sophisticated, audacious, and according to the operational orders I was reading, it had been approved at the highest levels of British command. If it had been executed as designed, it would have been one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the early war, potentially crippling Rommel's offensive before it truly began. I spent 3 days reading and rereading those documents, trying to reconcile them with the historical record I knew. The tactical plan was brilliant. British forces would appear to be caught unprepared at Mechili, inviting German attack. Meanwhile, armored units would be positioned in hidden locations to the north and south, using the desert terrain for concealment. When German forces committed to attacking what they believed was an isolated garrison, the British armor would strike from both flanks simultaneously, crushing the attackers in a coordinated assault. Artillery positioned on the high ground would provide devastating fire support. It was textbook combined arms warfare, executed in conditions perfect for the maneuver, but according to history, none of that happened, or did it? The more I read, the more I realized these weren't planning documents for an operation that never occurred. These were after-action reports, communications logs, intelligence summaries from an operation that had been executed, and according to these classified documents, it had worked exactly as planned. I immediately contacted my former colleague at the British National Archives, a historian named Margaret Chen, who specialized in World War II military records. I sent her scans of the documents and asked if she'd ever seen anything similar. Her response came within hours, and her message was terse. "Don't discuss this over email. I'm flying to Washington. We need to talk in person." Margaret arrived 2 days later, looking like she hadn't slept. We met in a secure reading room at the National Archives in College Park, surrounded by boxes of classified materials. She pulled out her laptop and showed me what she'd found in British archives. Parallel documentation describing the same operation, the same tactical plan, the same execution. But she'd also found something else, something that explained why this had been buried. "The ambush at Mechili worked," she said quietly, her British accent somehow making the words more ominous. "It worked brilliantly. German casualties were catastrophic. Rommel lost nearly 40% of his armor in a single engagement. His offensive was stopped cold. For 2 weeks in April 1941, the Africa Corps was combat ineffective, desperately trying to regroup and absorb losses that should have been impossible in an open desert engagement." I stared at her. "Then why does every history book say the British lost? Why is Mechili taught as a defeat?" Margaret pulled out more documents, these marked with higher classification levels. Because 2 weeks later, Churchill made a decision that changed everything. He ordered forces withdrawn from North Africa to support operations in Greece. The troops that had won at Mechili, the armor that had devastated Rommel's forces, they were pulled out and sent to the Balkans. And Rommel, who'd been on the edge of disaster, suddenly found himself facing a weakened opponent. He recovered, regrouped, and went on the offensive again. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The victory at Mechili became politically problematic. Churchill's decision to withdraw forces from North Africa was controversial. If the public and Parliament knew that British forces had just won a major victory, that they'd crippled Rommel and had him on the defensive, the decision to withdraw would have been impossible to defend. So the victory was reclassified as a defeat. The narrative was changed. Mechili became a story of British incompetence rather than German disaster, and the troops who'd won the battle were ordered to never speak of what really happened. I felt sick. One of the most brilliant tactical victories of the war, achieved through careful planning and brave execution, had been deliberately rewritten as a humiliating defeat. Thousands of soldiers who'd fought and won had been forced to accept a false narrative that diminished their achievement. And for 80 years, historians like me had been teaching the lie, never knowing the truth. Over the following weeks, Margaret and I dove deeper into the research. We tracked down veterans who'd been at Mechili, men now in their late 90s or early hundreds, scattered across Britain, Australia and New Zealand. Many were reluctant to talk, still bound by classification orders and decades of habitual secrecy. But a few, knowing they didn't have many years left, decided the truth needed to be told. I flew to Adelaide to meet with Geoffrey Morrison, a former tank commander who'd been part of the ambush force. He was 98 years old, living in a nursing home, his body frail but his mind still sharp. When I showed him the operational documents I'd found, tears filled his eyes. "Somebody finally found it," he whispered. "Somebody finally knows what we did." Over the course of 3 days, Geoffrey walked me through the entire operation. The preparation had begun weeks before, with British intelligence carefully feeding information to German reconnaissance, creating the impression that Mechili was an isolated garrison without significant support. Meanwhile, armored units moved into position under cover of darkness, using the terrain to hide their presence. The vehicles were camouflaged extensively, covered with sand-colored netting, positioned in wadis and behind rocky outcrops where German aerial reconnaissance couldn't spot them. The hardest part was waiting, Geoffrey explained, his voice carrying the weight of memory. We sat there for 5 days, hidden in the desert, watching German scouts probe our positions, knowing they were reporting back that Mechili was ripe for the taking. We couldn't move, couldn't show ourselves, just had to wait for them to commit to the attack. On April 8, 1941, Rommel took the bait. German forces, believing they were facing an isolated and vulnerable garrison, launched a major assault on Mechili with approximately 80 tanks and substantial infantry support. They approached from the east, moving fast, expecting to overrun the position quickly. The British garrison engaged them immediately, putting up fierce resistance but appearing to be overwhelmed, exactly as planned. When the Germans were fully committed, Geoffrey continued, when all their armor was in the kill zone and they thought they were winning, the commander gave the signal. Both flanking forces attacked simultaneously. We came out of those wadis at full speed, 60 tanks from the north, another 50 from the south, hitting them from both sides while they were focused on the garrison to their front. The German response was chaos, caught completely by surprise, with British armor suddenly appearing from directions they'd believed were clear. The German tanks tried to respond to threats from 3 directions simultaneously. British artillery positioned on high ground and pre-registered on the kill zone opened up with devastating accuracy. German tanks were destroyed in minutes, their formations shattered, their command structure disrupted. It wasn't a battle, Geoffrey said, his voice quiet. It was a slaughter. We destroyed tank after tank and they couldn't maneuver, couldn't respond effectively. Their radios were jammed. We'd planned for that too. They couldn't coordinate, couldn't retreat in good order. By the time it was over, maybe 30 of their tanks managed to withdraw. The rest were burning in the desert. The engagement lasted less than 3 hours. When it ended, the Germans had lost 52 tanks destroyed, 18 more damaged and abandoned, and over 400 casualties. British losses were minimal, fewer than 20 killed, and a dozen tanks damaged. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the early war, achieved through superior planning, perfect execution, and tactical brilliance. We knew we'd done something special, Geoffrey told me. The officers were talking about how this would change everything, how we'd stopped Rommel cold, how the Africa Corps was finished. We thought we'd be pursuing them across Libya, driving them back to Tripoli. Instead, 2 weeks later, we got orders to withdraw. to leave our positions, abandon the advantage we'd gained and redeploy to Greece. We couldn't believe it. The withdrawal from North Africa in late April 1941 was presented as a strategic necessity, supporting Britain's commitment to defend Greece against German invasion. But Geoffrey and his fellow soldiers knew the truth. They were abandoning a victory, surrendering an advantage that had cost blood and brilliance to achieve. And then came the final insult, the order that changed history. "An officer came to our unit," Geoffrey said, anger still evident in his voice after 80 years. He told us that for operational security reasons, the details of the Mechili engagement were being classified. We were not to discuss the battle, not to claim victory, not to contradict official reports that might characterize the engagement differently. He made it clear that disobedience would be treated as a breach of military discipline, so we stayed quiet. We went to Greece, fought there, and watched as Rommel recovered and went on to take Tobruk and push into Egypt. And we all knew, that it didn't have to happen that way. I found similar stories from other veterans. An Australian artillery officer, who'd coordinated the fire support, described the precision of their bombardment, how they'd practiced for weeks to ensure they could deliver accurate fire on coordinates they'd never seen, trusting the spotters and the plan. A British infantry officer, who'd been part of the Mechili garrison, described the fear of holding their position while German tanks approached, knowing they had to appear vulnerable while trusting that help was hidden nearby. Each of them told the same story: a brilliant plan, perfect execution, overwhelming victory, followed by political betrayal and enforced silence. They'd done everything asked of them, had achieved what should have been impossible, and then watched as their achievement was erased from history and rewritten as failure. Margaret and I compiled all the evidence: operational documents, after-action reports, communications logs, veteran testimonies, even German records that we tracked down through archives in Berlin. The German documents were particularly revealing. Rommel's own reports from mid-April 1941 described a catastrophic engagement at Mechili, where the enemy demonstrated unexpected tactical sophistication and inflicted unacceptable losses that require immediate reinforcement before offensive operations can resume. German casualty reports confirmed the British accounts: 52 tanks destroyed, substantial infantry losses, complete tactical defeat. For 2 weeks, Rommel's reports to Berlin were pessimistic, describing his forces as combat ineffective and requesting permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Then, suddenly, the tone changed. New reports described British withdrawal, German forces advancing unopposed, Mechili falling without significant resistance. The Germans couldn't believe their luck, couldn't understand why the British were abandoning positions of strength. By August, Margaret and I had assembled a comprehensive picture of what really happened. The tactical plan had been developed by a brilliant British officer named Colonel James Waverley, who understood desert warfare better than almost anyone. Waverley had recognized that the open desert, which seemed to favor mobile German forces, could be turned to British advantage if they could lure the enemy into a prepared kill zone. The terrain around Mechili was perfect for the ambush: open ground for German approach, hidden wadis for British positioning, high ground for artillery support. Waverley had sold the plan to General Wavell, commander of British forces in the Middle East, who'd approved it despite the risks. If the Germans didn't take the bait, if they detected the hidden armor, if anything went wrong, the result could be catastrophic. But Waverley had been confident, and his confidence had been justified. The plan worked perfectly, achieving exactly what it was designed to achieve. Then Churchill's decision to support Greece had changed everything. The Prime Minister faced an impossible choice: abandon Greece to German invasion or weaken the successful North African campaign. He chose Greece for political and strategic reasons that historians still debate. But that choice required rewriting what happened at Mechili. A major tactical victory became an embarrassing defeat, making the withdrawal seem like a reasonable response to failure rather than an abandonment of success. We prepared to publish our findings in the Journal of Military History, knowing it would be controversial. We were accusing the British government of deliberately falsifying military history, of forcing soldiers to accept a false narrative, of erasing one of the most brilliant tactical achievements of the war. We anticipated pushback from official sources, criticism from established historians who'd built careers on the accepted narrative. What we didn't anticipate was the fierce resistance from within the military history community itself. When we submitted our article, 3 peer reviewers rejected it, not because our evidence was insufficient, but because accepting our findings would require rewriting significant portions of the established North African campaign narrative. One reviewer actually wrote, "Even if the author's claims are accurate, publishing this material would create confusion and undermine confidence in historical scholarship." Margaret was furious. "They're saying that truth is less important than maintaining the status quo, that we should continue teaching a lie because correcting it would be inconvenient. That's not scholarship, that's propaganda." We appealed the decision, provided additional documentation, and eventually found a journal willing to publish. The article appeared in Military History Quarterly in December under the title "The Hidden Victory: Reassessing the Battle of Mechili, April 1941. The response was explosive. Media outlets picked up the story immediately. Veterans groups demanded official acknowledgement of what had really happened. The British government faced questions in Parliament about why military records had been falsified and why soldiers had been silenced. Within weeks, the Ministry of Defence announced it would conduct a comprehensive review of classified materials related to the North African campaign. I received hundreds of messages from families of veterans who'd fought at Mechili, people who'd grown up hearing their fathers or grandfathers insist that the history books were wrong, that they'd actually won the battle, only to be dismissed as confused or suffering from wartime trauma. Now those veterans were being vindicated, their accounts confirmed by official documents. Geoffrey Morrison, the tank commander I'd interviewed in Adelaide, died 3 weeks after our article was published. His daughter called to tell me that he'd spent his final days in peace, knowing that the truth had finally emerged. "He read your article 5 times, she told me through tears. He kept saying, 'Now they know. Now everyone knows what we did. Thank you for giving him that before he died.'" In March, the British government released a formal statement acknowledging that the historical record regarding Mechili had been incomplete and in some respects inaccurate. They confirmed that British forces had achieved a significant tactical victory in April 1941 and that the narrative of defeat had been adopted for operational security and strategic communication purposes at the time. It was the closest thing to an official admission of historical falsification we were likely to get. The military academies began updating their curricula immediately. The Battle of Mechili became a case study in successful ambush tactics, in the use of terrain for tactical advantage, in the importance of deception and surprise in armored warfare. Colonel Waverley, whose brilliance had been hidden for 80 years, was finally recognized as one of the most innovative tactical thinkers of the early war years. But the story also became a cautionary tale about the intersection of military achievement and political necessity, about how wars are not just fought, but also narrated, about how truth can be sacrificed to political convenience. The soldiers who fought at Mechili had done everything right, had achieved a near-perfect tactical victory, and had been rewarded with erasure and false shame. I was invited to speak at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, delivering a lecture on the Mechili operation to an audience of British officers and cadets. Standing in that historic institution, I talked about the brilliance of Waverley's plan, the courage of the soldiers who executed it, and the tragedy of its erasure. But I also talked about the responsibility of historians to pursue truth even when it's inconvenient, to question accepted narratives, to give voice to those who were silenced. The ambush at Mechili was brilliant, I told the assembled officers. It was everything a military operation should be, carefully planned, boldly executed, devastatingly effective. The soldiers who fought there deserved to have their achievement recognized and celebrated. Instead, they were ordered to be silent, to accept a false narrative that diminished their accomplishment. That injustice lasted for 80 years, and it only ended because some documents survived, because some veterans kept their memories alive, and because historians were willing to challenge the accepted story. A young captain raised his hand. "Sir, what does this teach us about military history more broadly? If something this significant was hidden for so long, what else might we have wrong?" It was exactly the right question, the one Margaret and I had been grappling with since we first discovered the truth about Mechili. "It teaches us that official histories are written by people with agendas," I responded. "Political considerations, institutional interests, personal reputations, all of these things influence what gets recorded and what gets hidden. The soldiers on the ground often know the truth, but they don't control the narrative. Our job as historians is to find those buried truths, to give voice to those who were silenced, and to ensure that future generations learn from accurate history rather than convenient mythology. The lecture was recorded and distributed widely, becoming required viewing at several military academies. The story of Mechili entered the broader conversation about military history, about how we remember wars, about whose stories get told and whose get erased. It became more than just a correction to the historical record. It became a symbol of the importance of truth in understanding our past. Margaret and I continued our research, finding other instances where military operations had been mischaracterized or hidden for political reasons. We discovered a pattern. When military success became politically inconvenient, when victories didn't fit the desired narrative, they were often rewritten as defeats or simply erased. Mechili was dramatic because of the scale of the victory and the completeness of its erasure, but it wasn't unique. In June, I returned to Adelaide to visit Geoffrey Morrison's grave. His family had arranged for a new headstone, one that included the words, "Hero of Mechili, April 1941. Standing in that quiet cemetery, I thought about all the soldiers who'd fought in that brilliant ambush, who'd achieved something extraordinary, and who'd been forced to pretend it never happened. Most of them died without seeing their achievement recognized, but at least now, finally, the record was correct. The truth was known. The most brilliant ambush in the desert had finally been acknowledged. The trap at Mechili, executed with precision and resulting in overwhelming victory, was no longer a hidden chapter of history. Colonel Waverley's tactical genius was recognized. The soldiers who'd fought there were honored, and the lesson was preserved, that truth matters, that historical accuracy is worth fighting for, that the stories of those who served deserve to be told honestly, even when the truth is complicated or politically inconvenient. As I walked back to my car that day in Adelaide under the Australian sun, I felt a sense of completion. The work wasn't finished. There were other buried stories to uncover, other truths to be told, but this one, at least, had been resolved. The most brilliant ambush in the desert had begun in April 1941, and it had ended in triumph. It had just taken 80 years for the world to learn about it. Better late than never, I supposed. Better that the truth eventually emerges than remain buried forever. Geoffrey Morrison and his fellow soldiers could finally rest in peace, knowing their achievement was recognized, their story was told, and their sacrifice of victory for political necessity was at least acknowledged and honored.